The mansion was glowing with golden lights long before the guests arrived. Expensive cars rolled through the giant gates one after another while workers rushed around preparing everything inside. Music floated through the air from hidden speakers, and servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks and small desserts that looked too perfect to eat. Near the back hallway, a maid quietly wiped fingerprints from a glass table. She moved carefully, trying not to draw attention to herself. Her uniform was simple compared to the rich clothes worn by the people arriving outside. She kept her eyes low and focused only on her work. The mansion owner was standing near the entrance, greeting important guests with a practiced smile. He was known for being one of the richest men in the city. People admired his business success, but most workers inside the mansion feared him. He rarely spoke kindly to anyone who worked under him. To him, employees were invisible unless they made mistakes. That evening, he wanted everything to be perfect. The party was meant to impress several wealthy investors and famous guests. Every room had been decorated with fresh flowers, shining candles, and expensive artwork. In the center of the main hall sat a black grand piano that looked more like a museum piece than an instrument. The maid glanced at the piano while passing through the room. Her eyes rested on it for only a second before she continued walking. But in that tiny moment, something changed in her expression. It was almost as if she recognized an old friend she had not seen in years. One of the older kitchen workers noticed. "You play?" the woman whispered while arranging plates nearby. The maid quickly shook her head. "Not anymore." Before the woman could ask another question, loud laughter filled the hall as more guests entered. The rich businessman walked proudly among them, telling stories and shaking hands. Everyone listened closely whenever he spoke. Hours passed, and the party became louder. Glasses clinked together while conversations echoed through the mansion. The guests admired the expensive decorations and praised the owner's wealth. Some gathered near the piano, though nobody touched it. The businessman noticed the crowd forming around it and smiled. "You know," he said loudly, "I bought that piano from a famous musician. Cost more than most people's houses." Several guests laughed in amazement. One man jokingly asked, "Can anyone here actually play it?" The businessman looked around dramatically before his eyes landed on the maid carrying empty glasses nearby. "You!" he called out sharply. The room grew quieter. The maid stopped walking and slowly turned toward him. "Come here." She hesitated for a second but obeyed. Every eye in the room followed her as she approached. The businessman smirked. "Do you know how to play piano?" A few guests chuckled softly, already expecting the answer. The maid lowered her eyes. "A little." "A little?" he repeated with amusement. "Perfect. Then entertain us." The guests exchanged looks. Some found it funny. Others seemed uncomfortable but stayed silent. The maid stood frozen beside the piano. "Sir, I should get back to work." "No," he said, leaning casually against the piano. "Tonight you play." A nervous silence spread through the room. The maid's hands tightened around the tray she was holding. She could feel dozens of eyes staring at her. Her face warmed with embarrassment. She knew many people expected her to fail. One guest quietly muttered, "This should be interesting." The businessman stepped back and motioned toward the piano bench. "Go ahead." For a moment she looked like she might refuse. But then she slowly placed the tray on a nearby table and walked toward the piano. The sound of her footsteps seemed unusually loud in the silent room. Some guests pulled out their phones, expecting an awkward moment worth recording. The maid sat down carefully. Her hands rested in her lap while she stared at the piano keys. Up close, the polished black surface reflected the giant chandelier hanging above her. The businessman crossed his arms with a smug expression. "Whenever you're ready," he said. The maid took a slow breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her hands toward the keys. For a second, she closed her eyes. And then she began to play. The first notes were soft and gentle. Instantly, the room changed. The guests who had been whispering and laughing suddenly became quiet. The music flowing from the piano was beautiful. Far more beautiful than anyone expected. Every note carried deep emotion, like a story being told without words. The maid's nervousness disappeared as her hands moved across the keys with natural confidence. The music became stronger, filling every corner of the mansion. One woman lowered her drink slowly, staring in disbelief. Another guest whispered, "How is this possible?" The businessman's smirk faded. The maid continued playing, completely lost in the music now. Her fingers moved quickly and smoothly across the piano as though she had practiced her whole life. The sound was powerful yet emotional at the same time. It was not the kind of music someone learned casually. Even the workers standing near the doors stopped moving to listen. The room remained completely silent except for the piano. A younger guest quietly lowered his phone, no longer recording to mock her. Instead, he looked genuinely amazed. The businessman stared at the maid with confusion growing across his face. This was not supposed to happen. He had expected an embarrassing performance that would entertain his wealthy friends for a few minutes. Instead, the woman he barely noticed every day had captured the attention of every person in the mansion. The maid played as if the outside world no longer existed. For the first time in years, she looked truly alive. As the music grew more emotional, some guests could actually feel it touching them deeply. A middle-aged woman near the back wiped tears from her eyes without realizing it. The final part of the performance became softer again, almost heartbreaking. The maid's fingers slowed gently across the keys before the last note finally faded into silence. No one moved. For 2 long seconds, the entire hall remained frozen. Then applause exploded through the mansion. Several guests stood to their feet immediately. Others clapped harder than they had all night. Shocked voices filled the room. "Incredible! She's unbelievable! Where did she learn that?" The maid slowly pulled her hands away from the keys. She looked overwhelmed by the reaction around her. The businessman still had not spoken. For perhaps the first time in his life, he looked completely speechless. One of the investors stepped closer to the piano. "That was extraordinary," he said honestly. "You play professionally?" The maid shook her head softly. "No, that can't be true," another guest said. She stood up carefully from the piano bench, clearly uncomfortable with so much attention. The businessman finally found his voice. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The room became quiet again as everyone waited for her answer. The maid looked down at the floor for a moment before speaking. "My mother taught me when I was young." Her voice was calm, but there was sadness hidden inside it. The businessman stared at her differently now. The mocking confidence he had earlier was completely gone. One guest laughed nervously. "Well, I think she stole the whole party." Everyone agreed. But the maid did not smile proudly like they expected. Instead, she quietly stepped away from the piano as though she regretted ever sitting there. As she picked up the tray again, one of the wealthy women stopped her gently. "You have a real gift," she said sincerely. The maid gave a small polite nod before walking toward the kitchen hallway. The guests continued talking excitedly about her performance even after she disappeared from the room. But inside the quiet hallway away from the crowd, the maid stopped walking for a moment. Her eyes filled with emotion, because touching those piano keys again had awakened memories she had tried very hard to bury. The mansion was quieter the next morning, but the memory of the piano performance still lingered in every corner of the house. Workers in the kitchen whispered while preparing breakfast trays. Garden staff talked about it outside near the fountain. Even the security guards at the front gate were discussing the maid who shocked an entire room full of wealthy people. Inside the kitchen, the maid kept her head down while washing dishes. She moved quietly, pretending not to notice the looks she was getting from everyone around her. "You should have seen their faces," one worker whispered excitedly. "I thought that businessman was going to fall over from shock." Another worker laughed softly. "All those rich guests sitting there speechless. I've never seen anything like it." The maid stayed silent. An older woman drying plates beside her gave a warm smile. "You played beautifully." "Thank you," the maid answered softly. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone you could play like that?" The maid paused for a second before continuing to wash the dishes. "It's not important anymore." The older woman looked at her carefully but did not push further. Upstairs in his office, the mansion owner sat behind his large desk staring out the window. Papers and business files were spread in front of him, but he had not touched them all morning. His mind kept returning to the same image. The maid sitting at the piano. The music. The way the entire room had changed the moment she started playing. He could not understand it. He had spent years around wealthy people who paid for expensive music lessons and private performances, yet none of them had played with the emotion she carried in those few minutes. One of his assistants entered carefully. "Your meeting starts in 20 minutes. He barely looked up. "Cancel it." The assistant blinked in surprise. "Cancel?" "Yes." The assistant quietly nodded and left. The businessman leaned back in his chair, annoyed with himself. He hated distractions, and somehow a maid had become one. Finally, he stood up and walked downstairs. As he entered the kitchen hallway, conversations stopped immediately. Workers lowered their eyes and returned to their tasks. The maid was placing clean dishes onto a shelf when she noticed him approaching. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The workers nearby became completely silent. The maid looked uncomfortable. "I already told you. My mother taught me." "That's not enough to explain what I heard last night." She gave a small shrug. "I practiced a lot when I was younger." "You studied professionally?" "No." He frowned slightly. "Then how?" "I need to finish my work," she interrupted politely. The businessman was not used to being interrupted. But before he could respond, the older kitchen worker stepped between them holding a tray. "Breakfast is ready for the guests," she said carefully, trying to break the tension. The maid quietly walked away toward the storage room. The businessman watched her leave, more curious now than before. Later that afternoon, he called one of his employees into the office. "I want information about the maid from the kitchen staff." The employee looked confused. "Information? Her background, family, education, whatever you can find." The employee nodded slowly. "Of course." By evening, the businessman received a thin file containing basic information. He opened it casually at first, but as he read through the pages, his expression slowly changed. The maid had grown up in a small apartment across the city with her mother, who worked as a music teacher. According to the records, she began learning piano at a very young age and showed unusual talent early in life. There were old certificates from local music competitions, awards, scholarship offers, photos from small performances years ago. The businessman stared at one faded picture for several seconds. It showed a teenage girl sitting proudly beside a piano, smiling brightly at the camera. It barely looked like the quiet maid working in his mansion now. He kept reading. Her mother became seriously ill when she was still young. Medical bills piled up quickly, forcing them into debt. Eventually, she left music school to work full-time and help support the family. A few years later, her mother passed away. After that, the records became thin. Small jobs, cleaning work, temporary housing. Nothing about music anymore. The businessman slowly lowered the file onto his desk. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Guilt. That night, the mansion hosted a smaller dinner gathering. Several guests from the previous evening returned, still talking about the piano performance. One woman laughed while sipping her drink. "I still can't believe your maid plays better than most concert musicians I've heard." Another guest added, "You should hire her as entertainment for every event." The businessman did not laugh. Instead, he quietly asked, "Did any of you record it?" A younger guest raised his phone. "Only a short clip." "Send it to me." Within minutes, the video arrived. The businessman watched it alone in his office after the guests left. Even through a phone screen, the music felt powerful. But what disturbed him most was the expression on the maid's face while she played. She had looked happy. Not the forced polite smile she wore while working. Real happiness. And somehow he had turned that private part of her life into entertainment for strangers. Downstairs, the maid sat alone in a small staff room during her break. A cup of tea rested untouched beside her. She stared silently at the wall while memories filled her mind. A tiny apartment filled with music. Her mother gently guiding her fingers across piano keys. Late nights practicing until her hands hurt. Dreaming of performing on real stages one day. Back then, music had felt like the center of her world. But after her mother became sick, everything changed. She remembered working long hours at small jobs while trying to continue lessons. She remembered hospital bills covering the kitchen table. She remembered promising herself she would return to music one day. But one day became years. And slowly, the piano disappeared from her life completely. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The older kitchen worker entered carrying fresh tea. "You're hiding in here again," the woman said kindly. The maid gave a tired smile. The woman sat beside her. "Everyone's still talking about your playing. I wish they'd stop." "Why?" The maid stared down at her hands. "Because it reminds me of things I tried to forget." The older woman remained quiet. After a moment, the maid spoke again. "My mother believed music could change lives," she said softly. "She sacrificed everything so I could learn." Her voice grew weaker. "And in the end, I still became this." The older woman frowned immediately. "Don't say that." The maid looked confused. "There's nothing wrong with honest work," the woman continued firmly. "And talent doesn't disappear just because life becomes difficult." The maid stayed silent. The older woman smiled gently. "Last night, when you played, you looked different." "Different?" "Like someone who finally remembered who they are." The words stayed in the maid's mind long after the woman left the room. Meanwhile upstairs, the businessman could not stop replaying the performance video. He watched it again and again. Each time he noticed something new. The confidence in her hands. The emotion in the music. The sadness hidden behind her eyes. Finally, he turned the phone screen off and sat quietly in the dark office. For years, he had judged people by appearance, status, and money. But the woman he had treated like a joke carried more real talent than most people at his expensive parties. And for some reason, that realization unsettled him deeply. Outside the office window, rain slowly began falling over the city. Downstairs, in the quiet staff room, the maid closed her eyes as memories of the piano returned once more. And for the first time in many years, a small part of her wondered if maybe her story with music was not completely over yet. 3 days passed after the party, but the mansion still felt different. The workers continued whispering about the piano performance whenever the maid walked by. Some smiled at her with admiration now instead of barely noticing her presence. A few even asked if she would ever play again. She always gave the same quiet answer. No. But deep inside, the music had already returned to her thoughts. Every night after work, she found herself remembering old songs her mother used to teach her. Sometimes while cleaning empty rooms, her fingers would move softly against her palm, as if touching invisible piano keys. She tried to ignore it. Life had already taught her what happened when people held on to impossible dreams. That afternoon, the mansion owner sat in his office preparing for another business meeting when one of his guests from the party arrived unexpectedly. The man entered carrying excitement on his face. "I can't stop thinking about that maid," he said immediately. The businessman looked up from his desk. "You came all the way here to talk about piano music?" "I came because I own a music theater," the guest replied. "And I know talent when I hear it." The businessman leaned back silently. The guest continued, "I want to offer her a chance to perform." The room became quiet. "A public performance?" the businessman asked. "Yes, a small one at first. Nothing huge. But people would come. Trust me." The businessman frowned slightly. "She works here. She also has a gift she buried for years." Those words stayed hanging in the air. The businessman looked toward the window for a moment before speaking again. "You really think she's that good?" The guest laughed softly. "I've spent 20 years around musicians. Most play notes. Very few make people feel something." He paused. "She does." Later that evening, the businessman walked downstairs searching for the maid. He found her alone in the library dusting shelves. The giant room was quiet except for the soft sound of cloth brushing wood. "We need to talk," he said. She immediately straightened. "Did I do something wrong?" The question bothered him more than he expected. "No." She waited silently. "One of the guests from the party owns a theater," he explained. "He wants you to perform there." The maid stared at him as if she misunderstood the words. "Perform?" "Yes." A small nervous laugh escaped her lips. "No." The answer came so quickly that it surprised him. "You didn't even think about it." "There's nothing to think about." "He's serious." "So am I." She returned to dusting the shelves, hoping the conversation would end. But the businessman stayed there. "You played in front of a room full of strangers without preparation," he said. "And every person there was impressed. That was different." "How?" She stopped moving. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she quietly answered, "Because nobody expected anything from me." The businessman frowned slightly. She continued softly, "If I perform publicly, people will expect something great. And what if I can't do it again?" "You can. You don't know that." For the first time, frustration entered her voice. "I haven't touched a piano properly in years," she said. "That night was just a moment." "It didn't look like just a moment." She shook her head. "You don't understand." The businessman remained silent. The maid slowly placed the cloth onto a shelf before continuing. "When my mother was alive, music was everything to us," she said quietly. "Every competition, every lesson, every performance, she was there." Her eyes lowered. "After she died, I stopped playing." The room felt heavier now. "Because it hurt too much?" he asked carefully. She nodded once. The businessman did not know what to say after that. Before leaving, he simply said, "The offer is still there if you change your mind." But after he walked away, the maid whispered softly to herself, "I won't." The next morning, life in the mansion continued as usual. Breakfast trays, cleaning schedules, guests arriving and leaving. But something had changed inside the businessman. He noticed things he never cared about before. The exhaustion on workers' faces. How quietly they moved around him. How nervous they became whenever he entered a room. For years, he had believed fear created respect. Now he was not so sure. During lunch, he overheard two workers speaking in the kitchen. "She used to practice piano for hours," one said quietly. "Her mother believed she'd become famous someday." The other sighed. "Life can be cruel." The businessman stood silently outside the doorway listening. Later that night, he found himself entering the empty music room alone. The grand piano sat under soft golden lights. He stared at it for a long moment before carefully pressing one key. The note echoed awkwardly through the room. He pressed another, then another. None of it sounded right. He suddenly understood something uncomfortable. Money could buy expensive instruments, but it could not buy talent. The following evening, the theater owner visited the mansion personally. This time he asked to speak directly with the maid. She looked nervous standing in the hallway while he smiled warmly at her. "You have remarkable talent," he told her honestly. "Thank you," she replied politely. "I'd like to invite you to perform at my theater next month." She immediately shook her head again. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because I'm not a performer anymore." The man studied her carefully. "Do you know how many people spend their whole lives wishing they had real talent?" he asked gently. "You already have it." The maid looked uncomfortable under his kind attention. "I appreciate the offer," she said softly, "but I'm not the right person." The theater owner smiled slightly. "You're afraid." She stayed silent. "That's normal," he continued. "But fear doesn't mean you should walk away." Still, she refused. After he left, the businessman found her standing alone near the back garden. The evening air was cool, and soft wind moved through the trees. "You turned him down again," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She looked tired now. "Because I know how life works." "What does that mean?" "It means dreams don't always survive reality." The businessman crossed his arms. "That sounds like giving up." A faint sadness appeared on her face. "No," she said quietly. "It sounds like experience." Her answer stayed with him long after she walked away. Days passed. Then something unexpected happened. One of the guests from the original party uploaded a short video of her piano performance online. At first, nobody in the mansion knew. But within 2 days, the video began spreading everywhere. People shared it across social media with captions like, "Unknown maid shocks wealthy guests. The most emotional piano performance ever. Hidden talent discovered at luxury mansion." Millions of people watched the clip. Comments flooded in from strangers around the world praising her music. Even television programs began mentioning the mysterious pianist. Inside the mansion, workers gathered around phones watching the video repeatedly. "That's you," one young worker said excitedly. The maid looked horrified. She watched only a few seconds before turning away. "I don't want attention," she whispered, but attention had already arrived. The theater owner called again immediately after the video went viral. "This changes everything," he said excitedly. "People already want to hear you perform." The maid nearly refused again. But this time, the older kitchen worker stepped into the conversation. "Wait," the woman said gently. The maid looked at her. The older woman smiled softly. "Your mother fought hard for your music, didn't she?" The maid nodded slowly. "And you loved playing once." Tears quietly formed in the maid's eyes. The older woman continued carefully. "Maybe this opportunity didn't come back to hurt you. Maybe it came back to heal something." The room became silent. For the rest of the evening, the maid could not stop thinking about those words. That night, after everyone went to sleep, she quietly entered the empty music room alone. The mansion was completely silent. Moonlight shined through the tall windows onto the piano. She slowly walked toward it. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down. For a long moment, she simply stared at the keys. Then softly, carefully, she began to play again. The music filled the empty room like a memory returning home. Unknown to her, someone was standing quietly outside the doorway listening. The businessman. But this time there was no crowd, no laughter, no humiliation, only music. And for the first time since meeting her, he finally understood that the piano was never just an instrument to her. It was the last connection she still had to the life she lost. The video spread faster than anyone expected. Within a week, millions of people had watched the short clip of the maid playing piano inside the mansion. News pages reposted it. Music blogs talked about it. Strangers filled the internet with comments about the mysterious woman who shocked a room full of wealthy guests. Some people called her the hidden pianist. Others called her the maid with magic hands. Inside the mansion, life no longer felt normal. Workers smiled every time they saw her. Some even asked for pictures with her. Delivery drivers arriving at the gate whispered her name after recognizing her face from online videos. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had spent years trying not to be noticed. Now the entire city seemed to know who she was. That morning, she stood quietly in the kitchen preparing tea, while two younger workers excitedly watched another online interview about her. "They're saying your performance made people cry," one said. The maid gave a nervous smile. "People online exaggerate." "No, they don't," the older kitchen worker replied warmly. "Your music touched people." Before the maid could answer, the mansion owner entered the kitchen. The room immediately became quiet. But this time something felt different. Instead of speaking coldly like usual, he calmly walked toward the counter and poured himself coffee. Then he looked at the maid. "The theater owner called again," he said. She already knew why. "He wants an answer by tonight." The maid looked down at the floor. The businessman watched her carefully before adding, "You don't have to say yes." Everyone in the kitchen looked surprised by his tone. For years, he had pressured people into doing whatever he wanted. But now, for the first time, he sounded respectful. The maid quietly nodded. "I'll think about it." Later that evening, she sat alone outside near the mansion garden. Soft wind moved through the trees, while distant city lights glowed beyond the gates. Her mind felt heavy. part of her wanted to refuse again and return to the quiet life she understood. That life was difficult, but at least it was safe. The other part of her remembered the feeling of sitting at the piano again. The music, the emotion, the feeling that a forgotten piece of herself had finally awakened. Footsteps approached from behind. It was the older kitchen worker carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat beside the maid without speaking at first. "You're scared," the older woman finally said gently. "Yes. Of failing." The maid stared into her tea. "Of hoping again." The older woman smiled sadly. "That's even harder." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the maid quietly asked, "What if this is just temporary? What if people lose interest?" "Maybe they will," the woman answered honestly. "But that doesn't erase your talent." The maid stayed silent. The older woman looked at her carefully. "Your mother gave you music for a reason." Tears slowly filled the maid's eyes again. "You think she'd want you hiding forever?" That question stayed in the air long after the conversation ended. The next morning, the theater owner arrived personally at the mansion once again. This time, the maid met him in the front sitting room. He smiled warmly the moment he saw her. "I hope you have good news for me." She took a nervous breath. "I'll do it." The theater owner nearly laughed with relief. "Wonderful." But the maid quickly added, "Only once." "We'll start with once," he said happily. The performance was scheduled for the following weekend at a small downtown theater, known for live music and local artists. News spread immediately after the announcement. Ticket requests flooded in so quickly that the small theater sold out within hours. People were desperate to hear the mysterious pianist in person. Meanwhile, the maid felt panic growing stronger each day. At night, she practiced alone in the mansion music room after finishing work. Sometimes she played beautifully. Other times her hands shook from nerves and mistakes filled the room. The businessman occasionally listened quietly from outside the doorway without interrupting her. One evening after a difficult practice session, she slammed the piano lid shut in frustration. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You can." She turned sharply and saw the businessman standing nearby. "I made 3 mistakes in one song. You also played better than anyone I've ever heard." She looked away. "That doesn't mean people will like it." The businessman walked closer slowly. "For years," he said carefully, "I thought confidence came from success." The maid looked surprised by his honesty. "But watching you," he continued, "I think real courage is doing something even when you're terrified." She studied him silently. This version of him felt completely different from the man who mocked her at the party. Finally she asked quietly, "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. After a moment he answered honestly, "Because I treated you badly." The room became silent. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone," she said softly. "I know. And now you feel guilty." "Yes." At least he was honest. The maid looked down at the piano keys. "I spent years believing people only saw me as a cleaner," she admitted quietly. "That night proved I was right." The businessman's face tightened with regret. "I can't change what I did," he said, "but I'd like to help fix what happens next." For the first time since the party, the maid saw real shame in his eyes. And strangely, that mattered more than she expected. Finally, the night of the performance arrived. The small theater was completely packed. Crowds gathered outside hours before the show began. Reporters stood near the entrance, hoping to interview the mysterious pianist everyone was talking about online. Inside backstage, the maid stood frozen near the curtain. Her hands were ice cold. She could hear the audience talking loudly on the other side. Hundreds of people had come to hear her play. "What if they hate it?" she whispered nervously. The theater owner smiled kindly. "They won't. But what if I disappoint them?" He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Just play honestly. That's what people connected with in the first place." She nodded slowly, though fear still filled her chest. Out in the audience, the businessman quietly entered through a side door and sat near the back row, avoiding attention. Nobody recognized him at first. He looked around the packed theater in disbelief. All these people had come because of her music. The lights dimmed. Instant silence filled the room. Backstage, the maid closed her eyes for one long breath. Then she stepped onto the stage. The audience immediately burst into applause. The sound overwhelmed her. She had not stood on a stage since she was young. Bright lights shined down as she slowly walked toward the piano waiting at the center of the stage. She sat carefully on the bench. The applause slowly faded. For one terrifying moment, the theater became completely silent. The maid stared at the piano keys while fear rushed through her mind. What if she forgot everything? What if the internet excitement had all been a mistake? Then suddenly, she remembered sitting beside her mother years ago in their tiny apartment. "Don't play to impress people," her mother used to say softly. "Play to tell the truth." The memory calmed her. Slowly, she lifted her hands to the keys and began to play. The first notes floated gently through the theater. Instantly, the entire audience became still. The music was soft at first, filled with emotion and warmth. Then it grew stronger, deeper, more powerful. Every note felt alive. Some audience members leaned forward in shock. Others closed their eyes completely. The maid forgot about the crowd after a few minutes. Her fear disappeared as the music carried her somewhere deeper than words. In the back row, the businessman sat motionless. Watching her now felt completely different from the first night at the mansion. Back then, she had looked trapped. Tonight, she looked free. As the performance continued, emotion spread through the theater like a wave. Some people quietly wiped tears from their faces. The final piece became slower and more emotional than everything before it. When the last note faded away, silence filled the theater once again. Then suddenly, the audience exploded into applause. People stood to their feet immediately. The sound of cheering filled every corner of the room. The maid looked stunned. She had expected polite clapping. Instead, strangers were crying, smiling, and applauding louder than she had ever imagined. Backstage workers stared in amazement. The theater owner laughed happily while clapping harder than anyone. And in the back row, the businessman slowly stood with the rest of the audience. For the first time in many years, he was not impressed by money, power, or status. He was simply moved by another human being's gift. The performance changed everything overnight. By the next morning, videos from the theater were everywhere online. News stations replayed clips of the emotional audience standing and clapping while the pianist sat at the piano fighting back tears. People who had never cared about classical music were suddenly sharing her performance. Comments poured in by the thousands. "She plays with real emotion. I haven't cried listening to music in years. This woman deserves the world." Inside the mansion, workers gathered around phones during breaks, smiling proudly every time they saw another interview or article about her. The maid still could not believe any of it. She sat quietly in the staff dining room early that morning staring at a newspaper someone had left on the table. Her picture covered almost the entire front page. The headline read, "Unknown Maid Becomes City's Most Inspiring Music Story." She shook her head slowly. Just weeks earlier, most people in the mansion barely noticed her existence. Now strangers were calling her inspiring. The older kitchen worker sat beside her carrying breakfast. "You should frame that newspaper," the woman joked warmly. The maid laughed softly for the first time in days. "I still feel like this is happening to someone else. That feeling will pass." The maid looked down at the newspaper again. "I'm not used to people seeing me." The older woman smiled gently. "Maybe they're finally seeing the real you." Later that afternoon, reporters began gathering outside the mansion gates hoping for interviews. Security guards struggled to keep the entrance clear while cameras flashed constantly. The businessman watched the chaos from his office window. A few weeks ago, his mansion had represented wealth and status. Now people cared more about the maid who once quietly cleaned its hallways. Strangely, that truth no longer bothered him. In fact, part of him respected it. There was a knock at his office door. "Come in," he said. The maid entered carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she quietly said, "I came to thank you." He looked surprised. "For helping arrange the performance," she explained. I know you didn't have to. The businessman leaned back slightly. You earned that audience yourself. Still, the room felt tense. Too much had happened between them for simple conversation to feel easy. Finally, the maid spoke again. Can I ask you something honestly? Yes. Why did you humiliate me that night? The question hit harder than he expected. For several seconds, he stayed silent. Then he answered truthfully. Because I thought it was funny. The maid looked down quietly. He continued, his voice heavier now. I spent years surrounded by people trying to impress me. I stopped thinking about how my actions affected others. He paused. I treated workers like background furniture instead of human beings. The maid listened silently. The businessman slowly stood from his desk and walked toward the window. I built my whole life around power, he admitted. Money, control, status. He gave a bitter smile. And somehow I convinced myself that made me important. The maid studied him carefully. But watching you play, he continued softly, made me realize how empty all of that actually feels. The office became quiet. Finally, he turned toward her again. I'm sorry. The words sounded genuine. Not polished. Not forced. Real. The maid looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You embarrassed me in front of people who already looked down on me. I know. For a moment, I felt completely worthless. Pain flashed across his face. But, she added softly, that moment also brought music back into my life. The businessman lowered his eyes slightly. I don't know if I can fully forgive you yet, she admitted honestly. But I appreciate the apology. He nodded slowly. That's fair. For the first time since they met, the conversation felt honest between them. Not employer and worker. Just two people speaking openly. Over the next several days, music offers continued arriving nonstop. Small concert halls, television interviews, private events. Even famous musicians publicly praised her performances online. The theater owner called almost daily with new opportunities. At first, the attention overwhelmed her completely. But slowly, something inside her changed. The fear that once controlled her began fading little by little each time she played publicly. One evening after another successful performance, she returned to the mansion late at night. As she entered the front hallway, she stopped in surprise. The grand piano from the main hall was gone. Confused, she walked toward the music room upstairs. Inside, she found the piano carefully moved near the large windows overlooking the city lights. Fresh flowers sat beside it. The room felt warm and peaceful now instead of cold and decorative. The businessman stood near the doorway. I thought the piano deserved a better room, he explained awkwardly. The maid looked around silently. You changed the whole room? Yes. Why? He shrugged lightly. It seemed wrong leaving it downstairs as a decoration. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then the maid slowly sat at the piano bench and touched the keys gently. The businessman stayed quietly near the doorway while soft music filled the room. Not a performance. Not for an audience. Just music. After several minutes, she stopped playing and looked toward him. You've changed. The businessman gave a small laugh. I'm trying. That answer felt more honest than pretending he had already become a better person. Days later, the businessman attended a charity event hosted by wealthy business owners. Normally he enjoyed these gatherings, but this time the conversations sounded different to him. People bragged about expensive watches, luxury vacations, and powerful connections while ignoring the workers serving food around them. For the first time, he noticed how many people treated kindness like weakness. One businessman laughed loudly while mocking a hotel employee for making a small mistake. Several guests joined the laughter. But instead of smiling along like usual, the mansion owner suddenly remembered the night he humiliated the maid at the piano. And for the first time in years, he felt ashamed sitting among people who acted exactly the way he once did. That night, he returned home quietly and called his assistant into the office. I want to start a music scholarship program, he said. The assistant blinked in confusion. For schools. For young musicians who can't afford training. The assistant quickly nodded. Of course. And I want staff wages reviewed across every property I own. The assistant looked even more surprised now. Anyone working full-time should be able to live with dignity, he continued firmly. The assistant stared for a second before quietly answering, I'll handle it. Word of the changes spread quickly among workers. Employees who once feared the businessman now spoke about him differently. Not because he became perfect overnight, but because for the first time he was actually listening. Meanwhile, the maid's confidence continued growing. At another performance later that week, audience members lined up afterward just to thank her personally. One elderly man held tears in his eyes while speaking to her. Your music reminded me of my late wife, he said softly. Thank you. A young girl carrying a small piano notebook shyly approached her next. I want to learn piano because of you. The maid nearly cried hearing that. For years, she believed her dream had disappeared forever. Now her music was inspiring strangers she had never even met. Late that evening, she returned to the mansion exhausted but emotional. As she passed the music room, she noticed the businessman sitting alone inside staring out the window. He looked lost in thought. You're awake late, she said softly. He smiled slightly. Couldn't sleep. She entered the room slowly. For a moment they simply stood there in silence. Then the businessman asked quietly, Do you ever wish things had happened differently? The maid understood what he meant. She thought carefully before answering. I wish my mother could see this. Emotion filled her voice. But if life had been easy, maybe I would never understand the value of this moment now. The businessman nodded slowly. I spent years thinking success meant having more than everyone else, he admitted quietly. And now, he looked toward the piano. Now I think success might be becoming someone you can respect when nobody's watching. The maid smiled faintly. Outside, rain softly tapped against the windows while the city lights glowed below. And inside the quiet music room, two people who once stood on opposite sides of pride and humiliation now sat peacefully in the same silence. Both changed by the same music. Months passed, and life changed in ways nobody inside the mansion could have imagined. The maid who once quietly cleaned hallways was now performing in theaters across the city. Videos of her music continued spreading online, and people traveled from different places just to hear her play live. But even with the growing attention, she stayed humble. She still visited the mansion often, especially the kitchen staff who had supported her before anyone else believed in her again. The workers greeted her warmly every time she returned, proud of everything she had achieved. One afternoon, the older kitchen worker hugged her tightly near the back hallway. Look at you now, the woman said with tears in her eyes. Your mother would be so proud. The pianist smiled softly. I hope so. The mansion itself had changed too. The businessman no longer treated workers coldly. He learned employees' names, spoke respectfully, and even spent time listening instead of giving orders all day. At first, many workers thought the change was temporary. But months later, it was clear something inside him had truly shifted. The music scholarship program he created had already helped several young students begin professional piano training. Some came from families who could barely afford school supplies, yet now they had real opportunities because someone finally believed in them. One evening, the businessman stood quietly in the music room watching two scholarship students practice on the grand piano. The sound of nervous mistakes filled the room. But instead of frustration, he smiled. The assistant standing nearby looked surprised. You really enjoy this now, the assistant said. The businessman nodded slowly. More than business meetings. The assistant laughed softly. I never thought I'd hear you say that. Neither did he. Meanwhile, the pianist received an invitation that changed everything once again. A famous concert hall in the city was hosting a special music event attended by important musicians, reporters, wealthy guests, and talent scouts from around the country. They wanted her to perform as the final act of the evening. When she first read the invitation, her hands trembled. This was no small theater anymore. This stage had hosted world-famous performers. Fear returned immediately. That night, She sat alone in her apartment staring at the invitation for hours. Part of her still remembered the frightened woman forced to play piano in front of laughing strangers months earlier. Sometimes she still struggled to believe these opportunities were real. Her phone suddenly rang. It was the businessman. "You sound nervous," he said after hearing her voice. "I am. That's normal. This performance is huge. You've handled every stage so far." She sighed softly. "What if this time is different?" There was a brief silence before he answered. "Do you remember what you told me once?" She frowned slightly. "What?" "You said dreams don't always survive reality." She smiled faintly. "I remember." "Well," he continued, "I think you were wrong." The words stayed in her mind long after the call ended. The night of the concert finally arrived. The famous concert hall glowed with bright lights as expensive cars lined the entrance outside. Cameras flashed while reporters interviewed celebrities and musicians walking across the red carpet. Inside, the giant hall buzzed with excitement. Every seat was filled. People whispered eagerly about the mysterious pianist whose emotional performances had captured the internet. Backstage, the pianist stood near the curtain trying to calm her breathing. Her elegant dark dress looked nothing like the maid uniform she once wore inside the mansion. Yet despite everything changing around her, she still felt like the same person inside. The theater owner approached her with a smile. "Packed audience," he said proudly. She peeked through the curtain and nearly froze. Hundreds upon hundreds of people filled the massive hall. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Yes, you can. What if they expect too much?" The theater owner shook his head gently. "People don't come to your performances expecting perfection." He smiled warmly. "They come because your music feels honest." Those words calmed her slightly. Across the hall, the businessman quietly entered through a side entrance and took a seat near the middle row. This time, nobody saw him as the powerful millionaire first. Many people recognized him instead as the man who funded music scholarships and supported young artists around the city. That change still felt strange to him. As the performances continued throughout the evening, the pianist waited backstage listening carefully. Every minute increased her nervousness. Then finally, the announcer stepped onto the stage. "And now," he said with a smile, "please welcome the performer whose music has inspired millions around the world." The audience erupted into applause immediately. Backstage, the pianist closed her eyes for one long breath. Then she walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than anything she had experienced before. The applause echoed through the giant concert hall as she slowly approached the piano waiting at center stage. For a brief moment, she remembered the first night inside the mansion. The mocking smiles, the humiliation, the fear. If someone had told her that night she would one day stand on this stage, she never would have believed it. The applause slowly faded as she sat at the piano bench. Silence filled the hall. She looked down at the keys, and suddenly, she thought about her mother again. Not the painful hospital memories this time, the happy memories. Music lessons in their tiny apartment. Warm laughter. Late-night practice sessions. The dream they once shared together. A small smile appeared on her face. Then she began to play. The first notes drifted softly across the giant hall. Instantly, the audience became still. Her music carried emotion deeper than words. Every note felt personal, almost like she was telling the story of her entire life through the piano. As the performance grew stronger, the audience seemed completely lost inside the music. Some people closed their eyes. Others quietly wiped tears away. The businessman sat motionless in his seat watching the stage. Months earlier, he had forced her to play for entertainment. Now she stood before one of the most respected audiences in the country, commanding the entire room with nothing except talent and honesty. The transformation felt unbelievable. The final piece became slower and more emotional than everything before it. Her fingers moved gently across the keys while silence filled every corner of the hall. And then, the final note faded. For 1 second, the room stayed completely still. Then thunderous applause exploded through the concert hall. The audience jumped to their feet almost instantly. People clapped, cheered, and shouted loudly while cameras flashed everywhere. The standing ovation continued longer than anyone expected. The pianist sat frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the reaction around her. Tears slowly filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness, relief, gratitude, disbelief. For years, she buried her talent because life convinced her survival mattered more than dreams. But now, standing in front of hundreds of cheering strangers, she realized something powerful. Dreams can disappear for a while, but sometimes they wait quietly for the right moment to return. Near the middle row, the businessman slowly stood with the rest of the crowd. His eyes filled with emotion as he applauded. Not because he discovered her talent, not because he helped her later, but because he had witnessed someone rebuild herself after life tried to silence her. The applause continued echoing through the hall while the pianist stood from the piano bench and bowed politely. In that moment, she was no longer remembered as the maid from a viral video. She was finally recognized for who she truly was: a gifted musician, a survivor, and a woman who turned humiliation into the beginning of a completely new life.